Thank you. I just have to thank Critique and the PhilSoc for allowing me this opportunity. Matthew, thank you very much. I also have to thank Dr. Smith in the back, my supervisor. So he's the one who's had to listen to me talk about this over the summer. And I'd also like to thank, though they're not here, Dr. McCool and Dr. Wiseman, who lead the In Parentheses research project, which through their presentations and looking into them are kind of the genesis of my work. I have a lot to get through, and I apologize for the length of the handout. They're mostly quotes and extracts, which I'll be discussing. I won't be discussing every single one, but it's kind of just to have a basis of, so you know what exactly I'm talking about. So just to get straight into it, I think, so the basis of my research project is really taking the understanding Aristotle had of the relationship between ethics and politics as key to a conception of virtue ethics. And then I'll be using that to assess and criticize the virtue ethics revival which took place in the 20th century. So I guess you could talk about the scholastics as other people who discuss virtue ethics, but from then, so for several hundred years, virtue ethics was kind of, wasn't really big in philosophy whatsoever. And it was only until 1958 with Anscombe's paper Modern Moral Philosophy that it was resuscitated. And now it's taken more seriously. So I'll be taking 4 figures: G.E.M. Anscombe, Iris Murdoch, Philippa Foot, and Alistair MacIntyre as representative and key. Obviously it's limiting, so I'm judging the revival based on these works, but I do know work by Julianus, Martha Nussbaum, Mary Midgley. There are other philosophers who are quite key to the revival, which I'm not looking at. So that's my aims, and my thesis is that this Aretaic turn has kind of lost sight of the central place politics had in ethics, which how Aristotle conceived it. And I'd like to argue that any virtue ethics must retain an Aristotelian or similar to Aristotle in form of understanding of the relationship. And I'd like to say that an account of virtues ethics which isn't sufficiently political, isn't sufficiently virtuous, and isn't a proper virtue ethics. So wider purpose of the kind of the work is kind of building a philosophy of human affairs which sees politics and ethics together, part of one thing. So I believe that a moral philosopher who has nothing to say about politics ultimately has nothing to say at all. And I think the same is true of a political philosopher who has nothing to say about ethics. But of course, I think this delineation is quite unhelpful, and I think I'm trying to move past that. Because what you need to say has to be true and retain this understanding. So you can write about, act utilitarianism, and you can also write about constitutions. You're doing political philosophy, doing moral philosophy, but I think you're doing both wrong. And a couple caveats: it's a work in progress, so I've only had one of my 2 research periods done, so it's incomplete, and even once I complete it, it'll still be incomplete because it's a bit much. I've kind of overreached myself. And there are some key works I haven't touched upon yet. So Natural Goodness by Foot and lots of MacIntyre's work I haven't yet approached. I'll probably be working with Foot, Virtues and Vices, and MacIntyre after Virtue. However, all these caveats, I do think that the gist of what I say is logically correct. So now to jump into the conceptual aspects behind them. So these 3 conceptual issues are going to be morality or ethics, politics, and teleology. I think you have to ask yourself before you jump in between the relationship of ethics and politics, a couple of things. Really, why ethics and not morality, and in what sense is politics going to be used? So really this is a virtue ethic and not it is not the framework of morality, of moral philosophy. Philosophers now largely do moral philosophy and work with morality. Morality being a system of, say, duties and obligations kind of conceived in Enlightenment philosophy onwards. And this is a framework which is foreign to virtue ethics and the ethics which Aristotle works with. Ethics now kind of has connotations of applied ethics, so looking at abortion and the environment, medical issues. I'm moving more to an understanding of ethics which has to do with questioning what's the good life for human beings, looking at questions of development and education and ethics, and really the shape of our lives and being and not solely just action. Not that more philosophers don't approach these things, but I think this is a richer account. And in terms of politics, I think I'll be using politics in a way which is quite foreign to a lot of people. So if you just go in here with an understanding of politics largely shaped by, I'd just say, using MacIntyre's terminology, liberal modernity, you'll just say, this isn't politics. Why are you saying this is political? You know, politics is this and that. And I think this is key because Aristotle conceives of areas which tend to be marked off as apolitical, free political. So we can see this, that for him, there isn't a concept of the self which isn't grounded in social relations and its political community. Whereas we kind of see the individual as cut off and atomized from everyone else, separate from everything else. This is a bit controversial, but I'd wager that every single institution, group, and relation has a political dimension to Aristotle. And really how we understand it, politics is mostly seen in creating apolitical or pre-political spheres, such as discussions of rights and inalienable rights, things like that. And then largely it's ethics in politics have a teleological account in Aristotle, and that is one which these things have a purpose and an end. They're not things in themselves, and they serve each other. So Aristotle assesses politics with it aims at the good being the good life for the individual and the community. Really, politics is seen now as something in itself. It's not, politics isn't aiming at some good for everyone. It is a business. It's the sort of thing we do. So now I'll jump straight into Aristotle, and I'll be looking at Nicomachean ethics and the politics. There's a lot to go through, so I'll be jumping through, but I have the quotes and extracts I'll be discussing on the handout, so if you guys could share it. So he begins the Nicomachean ethics by talking oddly about how everything aims at some good, and that because of this we must find out which is the most authoritative and architectonic good, which he claims is the political art, or other times translated as political science. And really I think this is quite key because he begins the ethics by discussing politics, and this illustrates the relationship quite well. In that the end of ethics is in politics, and that to consider ethics we must consider politics. This seems a bit odd, but I think it quite helps to say, think of a journey. If you're going to begin on the journey, you don't simply begin, you have to have the end in mind before you begin. And so that kind of shows the teleology of ethics in politics. He makes claims in book 1 that quite famous, by nature, a human being is political. So he firmly lodges our conception of humanity, a conception of humanity within politics. Other things which show this is that in discussing eudaimonia, he claims that one who is solitary, childless, cannot really be characterized as happy. This can seem quite odd because really our conceptions of happiness and the good are divorced from social goods, really. You can talk about your project, you can talk about your job, things like that. But really this illustrates that the capacity for eudaimonia, for happiness, is inherently tied up in the political community. And then this is further illustrated in the distinction between citizens and politicians. And he says that citizens, the end of the political as the best, is in that it exercises a very great care to make the citizens of a specific sort, namely good and apt to do noble things. So Aristotle's discussion is a dedication to citizens, and this is important because he's not talking about people in general. It's quite an exclusionary account, which excludes women, barbarians, foreigners, slaves, things like that. So it is really, it's a very rich account, but it's a very limited account. And you can also see it, and he talks about politicians. A politician is kind of seen now as a manager. So you want someone who's going to deal with the economy quite well, and who really isn't too, you might say too political. Too idealistic, or things like that. However, how Aristotle conceives of the politician, he says, the politician too ought to contemplate the soul, but he ought to contemplate it for the sake of these things, and up to the point that is adequate for what is being sought. And these things being eudaimonia and the good for the state in general. Now, to finish off this discussion of Book 1, I don't want to labour it too much. We can see I'll be looking at harm, justice, and friendship. So Aristotle's conception of harm is he gets criticised it almost by everyone, even by people who people like MacIntyre and Anscombe, because he doesn't have a proper account of harm and what is harm. What is the difference between not doing what's good for yourself and what's doing positively bad, what's wrong. I think obviously this would require a lot more work, but it's quite suggestive, and he kind of conceives as injustice as harm, and that harm is explicitly regarded with other people, and this can be seen in his discussion of the two virtues, greatness, magnanimity, and greatness of soul. And he says that they err, so you can err in these virtues, but you're not actually doing wrong because you're not hurting others, you're not affecting others. It's only to do with you and your own path in life. And then justice is it's the most significant virtue for Aristotle, and you see it very well. He does two radical things. He places at the top, he says that justice is said to be the greatest virtue, and that in justice every virtue is summed up. Secondly, he does this because virtue is the most political and the most other-regarding. Justice alone of the virtues is held to be another's good. It is the most complete virtue because he who possesses it is able to use virtue in relation to another. So this shows that the most important virtue is the most political and the most concerned with the most other-regarding virtue. And now moving on to friendship, it's quite very interesting. You could write quite a lot on Aristotle's conception of friendship, but almost against most political philosophers and moral philosophy, takes it to be key. And he writes that friendship is necessary with a view to life, and friendship holds cities together. And you can think of, so he's kind of conceiving of a political community wedded together through friendship. And just to see how radical that is, you can think of, say, Mill, and kind of on liberty, and kind of the inclination of why he wrote that is to allow people to escape from society, escape the political community. That's what you think liberty and the importance is. But here, Aristotle rejects that. And I earlier spoke about whether there are apolitical spheres in human life, but it's quite clear here that there aren't any. He speaks of Bacchic revelers and members of a dinner club and different communities, saying that all communities appear to be part of the political community. However, when he comes to the household, he does recognize that there is kind of a pre-political element to this. But this isn't as important, because although he says, by nature, human beings are more of a coupling being than a political one, inasmuch as a household is earlier and more necessary than a city. But, and this is important thinking back to things such as the social contract and man and nature, he says, human beings live together not only for the sake of begetting children, but also for the sake of things that contribute to life. So although, in this aspect, the household is pre-political, it well then gains that political dimension. I'll now move on to the politics. And so here this kind of begins with, he begins quite very clearly, every state is a community of some kind, and every community is established with a view to some good. So everyone always acts in order to obtain that which they think good, but if all communities aim at some good, the state or political community, which is the highest of all and embraces all the rest, aims at good in a greater degree than any other and at the highest good. So that's quite very bold, and we can go back and see how he conceives of how politics is all encompassing. And that's because what the state really is. It embraces and it's the highest community. And he remarks back what we just mentioned about, pre-society, after society. He just says that while the polis comes into existence for the sake of mere life, it exists for the sake of the good life. And this is a break from later and most of political philosophy, which conceives of the state of nature and then the contract covenant as both the reason a political community comes into existence and why it continues to exist. So then Aristotle makes a clear distinction between the beginning and the being continuation of a polis, and that although they may begin for mere life, its continued existence must be for the sake of the good life, an end which is beyond the state of nature. He continues to see the intertwined nature between his conception of ethics and politics through several remarks, some of them being, so the city belongs to a class of things that exist by nature, and that by nature man is a political animal. This develops on what was said earlier in the ethics, that man is a political being, and not only is man political, his relations, his associations, and his community are all by extension political. There almost is no escape from the political in Aristotle. And really this is sent to, he contrasts this very well by saying, he who is without city, by reason of his own nature, not accident, is either a poor sort of being or a being higher than man. So really, what it is to be human and what it is to be man, and big M, not, just men, his misogyny is coming through, really can only be made of sense through the political community, through the polis. And he also, going back, so there's a conflicting account, but in regards to go back to the family and the household, he claims that the city is prior to the individual in the order of things. And this is a continuation of the theme that the sense of the human can only be found through the polis. And quite radical things as well. Here it's important to think of, say, Nussbaum, or later MacIntyre, and why he's a Marxist. He writes that it is impossible to live well, or indeed at all, unless the necessary conditions are present. So he thinks there needs to be certain capabilities, certain bare minimums for every person to be able to be virtuous and thereby live a good life. And we can then see why his account is so exclusive, because you really have to be really almost an aristocratic Athenian gentleman in this account with these virtues. And just to see how the extent that the good is, there's an interesting quote about the business of household management, kind of what we see as economics now. And he claims that this is more concerned with human beings than in an inanimate property, that it is concerned more with the good condition of the human beings than the good condition of property. So I'm just trying to really bring home the kind of the totality of politics, how far it reaches and how important it is, and how it's intertwined with a sense of good, which we really no longer have. So that was book 1, and now I'll jump to book 7. Book 7 is where he begins to discuss his ideal constitution. So it's fairly important for our regards, because he's kind of giving more of a normative account. And really, when you talk about constitutions, you kind of think of something quite dull and quite restrictive. But here Aristotle takes it quite to be a radical thing. And he says that anyone who's going to make a proper inquiry about the best form of a constitution must first determine what mode of life is most to be desired. As long as that is obscure, the best constitution must also remain obscure. The best constitution, sorry, I just repeated myself. So just as the ethics began with politics, the most vital part of his politics began with ethics. In explicit terms, Aristotle illustrates that politics must have a teleological end in ethics. It must serve the polis, the political community must serve the good life. There is thus an intrinsic link between the constitution and modes of life, between politics and ethics. So this good life must be agreed to beforehand. It must be the basis of the political community. He writes that one must therefore find some agreed conception of the way of life which is most desirable for all men. Whether or not the same way of life is desirable in each case of the community as that is in the individual. So there's a distinction between the individual and the political community. However, he blows this apart and he concludes that the best way of life for individuals separately as well as for cities collectively is the good life, the life of goodness duly equipped with such stores of requisites as makes it possible to share in the activities of goodness. So both the individual and the political community, which they can only exist in, must aim at the good life, and this is kind of a joint venture. He ends on this discussion that there is one thing clear about the best constitution, one thing. It must be a political organization which will enable anyone to be at his best and live happily. And here I think there's a good contrast made in our understandings of constitutions and the states and government, and this can be seen in his discussions of Sparta. He says, quite generally, in most cities, most of the laws are only a miscellaneous heap of legislation, where they are directed in any degree to a single object, and that object is always conquest. He builds on this. The Greek cities of our day, which are counted as having the best constitutions, and the legislators who frame their constitutions, have plainly not drawn up their constitutional arrangements with a view to the highest goal. I think this is something which exists now as well. Quite generally, I don't think that has to be elaborated on. He continues, there has been a vulgar decline into cultivation of the qualities supposed to be useful and of a profitable character. The result of all this can be seen in Sparta. Here is a people who have stuck to their laws and never been hindered in carrying them out, and yet they have lost the ability to live in a way that has real value. Thus, the detachment of the political from the ethical leads to a loss in the ability to live a good life, which is really what virtue ethics is all about. And I think in this, we could say now in liberal modernity, we're all Spartans. So I'd like to conclude my discussion of Aristotle there with conscious time. I haven't touched upon everything I'd like to touch upon, but I have some suggestive quotes on the handout still, which kind of indicates what I would discuss if I had more time. So really, before we jump on to the four figures I'll be speaking, I'll just like to recap kind of the central aspects of this. And it's that there's a teleological account, so these things have a purpose and they have an end. And especially it's the relationship between the two. It's kind of, I find it difficult to kind of articulate it because ethics has its end in politics. Ethics is always aiming towards, it serves as the basis for the greater good of politics and the political community. But then political community is also always aiming, although for the wider political community, the best life for the individual. So it's really on an Aristotelian basis, one cannot care for the one ethics without for the other. And you cannot see them as separate spheres. And really, we are thrown into this position. We are intrinsically political, it's in our nature. So if you attempt to move from any of these aspects, you're going to go wrong, and I'm going to argue, you wouldn't have properly understood how virtue ethics should be conceived. So I will then begin my discussion of, I'm just looking now and I think, foot, okay. Sorry, I thought I didn't actually print it off. So Philippa Foot. So Philippa Foot alongside MacIntyre, I think I'd be safe to say, is probably seen as the biggest figure in resuscitating virtue ethics. And she worked alongside, she was really an Oxford philosopher, and I don't say that in a good way. However, she made some important moves, and I'm going to be, for whatever I say about these four figures, really they all made important breaks with the consensus which had been built in moral philosophy for the past 100 years, and they broke with them in important ways. And because they broke with them in important ways, I think that's why I scrutinize them so much. So I'm not really being harsh, but really I think it's really important what they're doing, and that's why you have to be heavy on them. So for time constraints, I'll be discussing one essay from Foote, and this is Morality as a System of Hypothetical Imperatives. This was first published in the 50s, but then she republished it in 1977 with a footnote which was several pages long, kind of building up on what she said. And I'll be discussing kind of two topics. I kind of have to make it more intelligible, so I kind of divided the points into confusion. I think she delivers a confused account of virtue and morality. And I also think in her arguments against Kant, she also makes arguments which also apply against Aristotle, and obviously that basis is why I'm saying it's a confused account. So really what hypothetical imperatives is about, she said in the introduction, is moving away from the presuppositions of emotivism and prescriptivism, which were the domineering kind of schools in moral philosophy when she wrote this essay in the 50s, but also from the widely accepted neo-Kantian supposition that immoral action must somehow be irrational. Now immediately, basing on what we just discussed, or a general acquaintance with Aristotle, this should sound some alarm bells, because not only for Kant but also for Aristotle, if you're irrational, you're going wrong and you're being immoral. And really, that we began the discussion with, we talk about ethics, not morality, so she's using morality here. So really we're going to see with Foote's kind of chafing with what she wants to say and what she's using to say it. So I'll just jump into the confusion. So she says, irrational actions are those in which a man in some way defeats his own purpose, doing what is calculated to be disadvantageous or frustrate his own ends. Immorality does not necessarily involve such a thing. Now, if you're only taking morality to be morality taken as a Kantian or utilitarian, I think she's largely correct in saying this, because she's working against the framework of morality, which I think you should do, and which virtue ethics kind of necessitates you do. However, as we all see, she's not distinguishing morality from ethics and calling for a move towards ethics, as Anscombe later does. She's working within the framework of morality against immorality, and she's bringing in virtues and virtue to help her do this, but there isn't the divorce which there needs to be, I think. And this can be seen in the second quote where she mentions moral virtue. This is what is moral virtue? It's kind of a combination of two different ways of conceiving of morality and how we should live being kind of fused together. This will make a lot more sense when I move on to Anscombe later on, because she kind of does this the right way. And just further to say really why it can't be an Aristotelian conception is because she says, she asks, can a man accepting only hypothetical imperatives possess other virtues besides that of charity? Could he be just or honest? This problem is more complex because there is no end related to such virtues as the good of others is related to charity. Now, here she's combining a Christian conception of virtue, the virtue of charity, so moving away from Aristotelian conception, but she's also claiming that charity is concerned with others, if I'm reading her correctly, in a way which no other virtue is. The way ethics and politics are part and parcel, you can't divorce them, and how we're intrinsically political and thereby moral in a way. Here she moves against almost all of these things. She says, discussing her conclusion that one who attempts to impel a moral person is relying on illusion, as if trying to give the moral automagic force, and saying that really you can't say that one ought to take account of the general good. She says this conclusion may be said to appear dangerous and submersive in morality. Perhaps you should even have less reason to fear if people thought of themselves as volunteers, banded together to fight for liberty and justice against inhumanity and oppression. I'm therefore putting forward quite seriously a theory that disallows the possibility of saying that a man ought to have ends other than those that he does have. That the uncaring or amoral man ought to care about the relief of suffering, the protection of weak. So here she's kind of divorcing morality and creating a sphere of morality which she may volunteer to. This directly goes against to Aristotle's conception. And this is why I have it against Kant and against Aristotle. She cites Kant and says, Kant would of course object to that I am treating men as if, in the army of duty, they were volunteers. And this is exactly my thought. Why does Kant so object to the idea that those who are concerned about morality are joining together? He supposes that in so viewing the matter we are forgetting our nature as human beings. And she also follows that up with saying, let us agree that a human being doesn't necessarily have moral ends. This is thoroughly against Aristotle as well as against Kant. But obviously Aristotle's conceiving it in terms of ethics and not morality. She rejects an end, and she rejects that we're intrinsically, political and then having to deal with it. So she finishes really by saying Kant's thought seems to be that moral rules are universally valid, in that they are inescapable, that no one can contract out of morality, and above all that no one can say that as he does not happen to care about the ends of morality, morality does not apply to him. Really, would this not be exactly what Aristotle would like to argue, with concerns over the use of moral being ignored? He would say precisely the same. So how I'm going to conclude on Foot is, I think, Foot's virtue ethics can be best seen as a confused account. She wishes to reject the obligations and duties of morality as conceived by Enlightenment philosophy, but does not have a proper account of the virtues to fall back on, nor does she believe she needs one, as she talks about us being volunteers, and actually morality being improved once we move away from the system of obligation, even though she doesn't provide an account of the virtues. The creation of a moral cause we can choose to volunteer is the creation of morality as a separate sphere which we must reject if we're an Aristotelian, and has no place in a proper account of virtue ethics. Her talk of moral virtue, rejection of ends, and confusion over justice and the nature of virtues are the primary weaknesses of her account. So you kind of have beginning to see a picture of the ways many modern virtue ethics are going to go wrong. And this is kind of developed in Murdoch. And just because I'm conscious of time, I'll spend less time on Murdoch. But the three big things which you have to understand of Murdoch is that she provides a very rich account of moral philosophy which deals with kind of the being and the inner workings of her own life. And it's very subtle, and it's, I think, very clearly miles ahead of lots of the people she was arguing against. However, I also think she has some fundamental issues which lead her to go wrong. And the main thing is, the two main things are in that politics is supplanted by art as the twin of morality. So really, instead of saying politics and ethics as part of philosophy of human affairs, she says politics and art. And she has several quotes here which I think can be quite dodgy, and I think intuitively we'd reject. So saying virtue is au fond the same in the artist as in the good man, and that is the selfless attention to nature. A great artist is in respect of his work a good man, in the true sense a free man. I think just a cursory thought of, Ezra Pound, Ted Hughes, pretty much any artist you could think that it's difficult to conceive what she means here. And really we can begin to see that this is kind of turning virtue ethics into an aesthetic endeavor. However, she does do good things. So in discussing morality, she also sees that moral philosophy needs to be grounded in our concrete lives. They're not abstract problems. And moral philosophy must be socially embedded in our lives, in the communities we live in. So her quote about Kierkegaard and describing the Hegelian system as a grand palace set up by someone who lived in a hovel at best in the porter's lodge. A moral philosophy should be inhabited. And she says things, so why saying it's a rich account is the area of morals and area of moral philosophy can now be seen not as a hole in the corner matter of depths and promises, but as covering the whole of our mode of living and the quality of our relations with the world. Pretty good. However, the approach she's taking is at odds with Aristotle and will lead to her kind of going very much astray when it comes to politics. She has two theses in her third, in the sovereignty of the good, in the sovereignty of the good, so the third essay in the collection of which I'm drawing these quotations from. She writes that, I assume human beings are naturally selfish and that human life has no external point or telos. She also has a quote from Plato, The Republic. She's a Platonist. She's not an Aristotelian. She deals with virtue, but in a different way to Aristotle. And she says that the Republic, it doesn't matter whether it exists or will ever exist. It is only a city in whose politics the good man can take part. So you have a worry here that it's a solipsistic account of virtue ethics. It's an aesthetic endeavor. And really this is taken home in moving to Metaphysics as a Guide to Moral, her mature work, which is huge. It's like 600 pages. She published it in the 90s. And she, helpfully for me, writes a big paragraph called On Morals and Politics. So that's where I'll be drawing the quotes from. I'll be just quoting some things here, and then I'll discuss them. So one quote I'd like to flag up is the first one. It is a central liberal idea that the utopian conception of a perfect state, even as a distant vision, is radically misleading and damaging. The society and the state cannot be perfected. Secondly, the acceptance of parliamentary democratic government itself involves the deliberate limitation of our moral aspirations. It is not the fundamental duty of the state to make us good. It is a fundamental task of each person to make himself good. It is, one might say, the duty of the state to make decent arrangements. Needless to say, there are no good societies. Decent societies are partly bad, but there is a crucial difference here, taken for granted, between open societies and others. Observance of human rights is one good test. Finally, utopian political thinking, the detailed imagining of an ideal society set in a political program, is checked in the liberal scene by tolerance, individualism, and related to these, agnosticism, and a Hobbesian common sense concerning human nature. So what Murdoch ends up doing is answering the question of what the relationship is between ethics and politics, which really I want these people to do, these philosophers to do, but she creates a cleavage between morals and politics, and she claims that they're separate spheres, and not only that, politics intrinsically leads to a compromise in our morals. The truly good can only be found in our private lives, and the good life is something which you can only find in yourself, away from everyone else, away from the political community. And she finds really the best. So you'd think from what she says in The Sovereignty of the Good that she'd have kind of a more radical politics, but really she kind of moves into a banal and accepting political philosophy of the liberal democratic consensus, which was at the time triumphant when she wrote this in the mid-1990s. And I think she kind of encapsulates quite well the problems with Murdoch and Foote's virtue ethics, which I would call really a bourgeois account of virtue ethics. It is no longer a socially embedded ethic which necessitates a political community and concern for the political community, but rather an aesthetic venture for the individual to better themselves. So moving on, so those two obviously make big grounds, but overall they miss the mark, especially if you want an Aristotelian conception of virtue ethics. Moving on to two figures which kind of do it better would be Anscombe and MacIntyre. So think of Anscombe as Foote's pairing. She's concerned with moral obligation in these questions, but she answers it in a better way. And really how she does this is she ends up rejecting the system and the framework of morality, talking about moral obligation and duties, and wants us to move more towards ethics, virtue ethics, and talking about these things. She also has a very Aristotelian conception of practical rationality, and really, which is what that means is that, and then there's the section on the political ethic, even though she doesn't explicitly write on politics, she wrote very little, and what she did write wasn't really addressing politics, so it's a bit difficult approaching Murdoch. It's very difficult, but I still kind of have to do it. So she wrote one big essay on political philosophy, and it's the source of the authority of the state, and it illustrates her Aristotelian conception, and I think it's quite important because she talks about, well, where does the authority of the state now, how is it justified, and where does that come from? And I criticize some aspects of it, so by saying that whether the question of the state, a government, is legitimate, she says it's a personal and private question. Her conception of political theory, as which she says, no political theory can be worth a jot that does not acknowledge the violence of the state. This is the fundamental question of political theory. I object to the latter, not the former, of course. But really what she concludes is it's a bit difficult, because that's how she writes, but so she says, what distinguishes authority of government from, rule by bandits? But she does say it might be that we live in the human world in which some of the bandits have got on top, so that they claim to right and exercising power is just a huge trick. But it's really not. The distinction lies in the association of the government with the system of administrative justice. So authority is based on a task, and that's a task providing a general human need. And you can think to citizens in Aristotle of providing this task, this general need to everyone. And she finishes by saying, a way of treating someone which puts him outside of the class of those for whom the task is performed puts him outside the class of those subject to the authority. So she'd say, well, if you're not a citizen in the way Aristotle conceives of, you have absolutely no obligation to the state, and the state really can't use violence against you. And it's kind of it's not a very clear point, but it's kind of, I'm using it to illustrate that she does believe that authority is being derived from a dedication to through a dedication and a work of a function. Jacob might disagree with me. He's doing his PhD on Anscombe, but I hope not. But more fortuitously, is that word? I don't know. She has a political ethic. So this is where I'm kind of trying to wring the towel out on Anscombe. And the first quote, so going back to Foote, she kind of says, she leads to a rejection of morality. She says, the term moral itself just doesn't fit in the modern sense to an account of an Aristotelian ethics. If someone professes to be expounding Aristotle and talks in a modern fashion way about moral such and such, he must be very imperceptive if he does not constantly feel like someone whose jaws have got somehow out of alignment. The teeth don't come together in a proper bite. I don't have this quote on the sheet, sorry. So we can see kind of Foote kind of doing that. But in terms of political ethics, the extracts with, I think, illustrate that she would, though she never did, she would support a kind of a capabilities, a bare minimum requirement for the political community. These can be seen in, it is a bit much to swallow that a man in pain and hunger and poor and friendless is flourishing, as Aristotle himself admitted. In the essay War and Murder, she says, for society is essential to human good, there being such a thing as the common good of mankind and visible criminality against it. And that is a political ethic, can be seen in the introduction. She writes about where she got into political philosophy. And she says she got interested in political philosophy in the 1970s simply out of an interest in the concept of murder, but I see the seeds of my interest in political theory where there are writings about war. I think quite indicative, just to finish on Anscombe, is that Mary Geach, her daughter, in an introduction to Human Life and Action, she says, and kind of this is where Anscombe kind of goes astray, I think. Mary Geach typifies it as, in pointing people along the road of virtue ethics without getting them to ponder the question of the architectonic end, perhaps she only gave them another way of being consequentialist. And consequentialist has a specific definition as Anscombe gave it. It's not just active utilitarianism, it's having a system of ethics and morality which does not prohibit certain acts indefinitely. So I conclude that she kind of points the right direction, but really she doesn't have enough work and she doesn't write enough for me to conclude anything. So overall she doesn't. So if you take what I take as central, even though she does things which I like, it is kind of off the mark. Really, if you understood Aristotle as I think you should, you would write more on political philosophy. And just to finish off, I'll try and blitz through MacIntyre. And if you have to go, because it's almost about to turn 3, it's perfectly fine. I know. It's being recorded, so I'll send it off. So before we jump into MacIntyre, you have to take 2 things into account, 2 approaches that he has. And it's a historical approach, so he's not proposing a normative argument like Aristotle does, where he says, here's my premise, conclusion, my next argument. He's giving an intellectual history. And this includes the social context and a look at the meaning of the words in this social context. He also has a big focus on language. And he thinks that our moral language is composed of fragments from a whole, and the fragments we do have come from wholly different contexts. And the upshot of this is that most of our moral language is unsuitable. So ethics and politics and after virtue. I'm going to jump straight into chapter 3, and he talks about how, similar to how Murdoch did, an ethics has to be socially, a moral philosophy, and motivism is no exception, characteristically presupposes a sociology. It also presupposes a claim that these concepts are embodied, or at least can be in the real social world. Thus, it would generally be a decisive reputation of moral philosophy to show that moral agency on its own can never be socially embodied. Like Aristotle, MacIntyre understands that ethics can only begin to manifest itself in social relations. To speak of a moral philosophy which does not do so would be to be intelligible, would be nonsense. Then there's a nice quote on the how they're part and parcel and how they're concretely embedded, talking about there are not 2 histories, one of moral and political, one of political and moral action and one of political and moral theorizing, because there are not 2 pasts, one populated only by actions, the other by theories. He recognizes the relation between the 2, but he also recognizes how they interlink and work off each other, being grounded in practical political and ethical philosophy. And then I'll jump to his discussions of how virtues really have to be tied to a specific political community, and this is the polis. This is chapter 12. It's the 3rd quote you have there. He begins to discuss Aristotle's conception of the virtues. He writes that Aristotle holds that the city-state is a unique political form in which alone the virtues of human life can be generally and fully exhibited. Thus, the political and philosophical theory of the virtues is a theory whose subject matter is the pre-philosophical theory already implicit and presupposed by the best contemporary practice of the virtues. This entails that philosophy necessarily has a sociological, as Aristotle would have said, political starting point. And really this shows that kind of how for MacIntyre, the sociological and the society kind of usurps the political, but he kind of uses these terms interchangeable, but he understands that virtues have their basis in this, and politics is very important. I'll just jump to his 3rd quote, just because really we're running out of time. In that, in this really kind of the crux of what I'm talking about. And in society where government does not express or represent the moral community of the citizens, but is instead a set of institutional arrangements for imposing a bureaucratized unity on a society which lacks general moral concerns, lacks general moral consensus, the nature of political obligation becomes systematically unclear. And really the upshot of this is that the tradition of virtues is at variance with central features of the modern economic order, and more especially its individualism, its acquisitiveness, and its elevation of the values of the market to a central place. It now becomes clear that it also involves a rejection of the modern political order. And then he ends with a discussion that we are not waiting for a Godot, but another doubtlessly very different Saint Benedict. And this is quite unclear, but I had an extract from a talk he gave this year where he kind of clarifies this, and it's quite funny. But so to conclude, where does this lead us? I think I'll read it off really. MacIntyre himself sums this up, and this is from his collection of essays, Ethics and Politics. He says, Aristotle tells us that ethics is part of politics. We cannot adequately understand the claims made in the Nicomachean Ethics except in the context provided by the politics. Of course, this isn't the understanding we now have, as seen by what Murdoch, Foote, and Anscombe purport. There's been a divorce, and that has allowed us to ignore that the ethics of the Nicomachean Ethics is the ethics of and for a citizen of the polis, and that the social practice articulated by Aristotelian theory is the practice of a polis. No ethics except as part of a politics, and no politics except as a part of the practice of a polis. But this is not necessarily so. We can have something similar without, obviously, the Aristotelian city-state. So that we cannot have an individualized account of virtue ethics, no bourgeois account which sees ethics as a mere or the realm for personal development. Simply, one cannot be concerned about one's good without being also concerned about the goods of one household and the good of one's political community. The upshot of all this is that a moral character for Aristotle cannot but have a political dimension. A good human being but no good at politics is incompatible with Aristotle's ethics and politics. It's also incompatible with much of the virtue ethics of today and the revival. And I think in that they fail in understanding Aristotle. So I think MacIntyre begins the path for a new and proper virtue ethics. Thank you.
So I have a few thoughts on this, but they're perhaps more at a slightly more general level. So perhaps has anyone else got some questions to start off with?
Just don't be shy. I think I approach these things in a kind of intuitive way, so I kind of jump from one thing to another. So if you didn't get anything and I didn't explain anything properly, just ask me to do so, and I'll do it.
Yeah, it's fine if you didn't understand what the hell was going on.
Yeah.
Please do ask that question. Okay, no, I'll give it a bit of a run then. So there's a branch of contemporary political theory which picks up and runs in a slightly different direction, disquiet about the linking between moral theory and politics. However, the direction which they take it in is not step back and go to ethics and politics. It's the idea that actually these two domains, the ethical, moral life, and the political life, although we may experience kind of the events of these two things simultaneously, and they have kind of equal claim over our lives at various different stages, they are still two distinct spheres of human experience. And so therefore, a kind of an account of political philosophy which is based in ethics is going to kind of always run to these concepts like justice or equality that we can kind of get some sense from ethics. However, there are big kind of political questions such as what's the nature of legitimacy, what's the kind of nature of authority, which seem to have a more distinctly political answer to them and yet are still norms. So do you kind of have any thoughts about that kind of immediate critique from the get-go of kind of Aristotle of actually how the ethical life and the political life are actually distinct.
Yeah, and I think my answer would really have to be that in approaching these questions, we have to conceive of how they're related, and that they are distinct is quite clear. He begins the ethics by talking about politics, but in the politic, he says that politics has a wider domain than ethics does. So he does immediately recognize that, and so does Aristotle, and clearly these figures do. But the point is not so much that they're distinct, or whether they're the same thing, because it's not either or of those things. It's really seeing that our politics has its basis and its beginnings in an ethics and the conception of ethics of what it is for the good life for each person. And then from that basis, we then build on to our political communities, whatever they may form, the nation state or smaller local communities as MacIntyre may advocate or anything like that. With this basis, we can then answer these questions that political philosophy has to deal with. And actually, I'd find it very difficult in discussing political philosophy to find a sphere of political philosophy which does not some way, in the end, relate back to an ethical conception. And a question of whether what it is, what purpose does this serve? And I think really the concept of teleology is really intrinsic into this. And it's not, so the purposes that the relation we're thinking of are ones of purpose and end of each thing. And these are, there are shared purposes and shared ends in both of them, even though the scope of politics may be wider than the scope of ethics. So that's how I deal with that question. Yeah.
Anyone?
There's the view that maybe seeing Aristotle as being so concerned with the political is sort of a bit naive, because he basically, it's only an argument that he basically wrote this book on the politics and how to behave in society, because
which figure, sorry?
He wrote this book, The Politics and the Ethics. It was about how to behave in society, because basically he didn't want philosophers to get killed like Socrates did, but that in the end he thought that you had to learn all of these things. You had to learn how to be just, how to be admired by other people, but in the end the highest sort of life was a theoretical life. So that maybe this is at odds with your view that for him the highest sort of life was the political life.
Yeah. So no. That's how. So I think it's at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, he starts beginning really what is the end, the best life, and he contrasts it with the life of politics and life of action and the life of contemplation, what you're talking about here. I think how we understand that and how we approach that can be seeing in virtue ethics itself, and that there is no one A life for everyone at every single point in time. And I think people could disagree with me, I'd put the discussion of contemplation at the end of one's life. And you can see this in his discussion of what's right for people at what age. So really you'd live your life, and hopefully when you're old and grey, you can dedicate your life to contemplation. But before all of that, you have your education, you have your moral development, and you have your engagement with politics. So the political life, I see it as serves as the basis for each citizen. But the end of each citizen's life, you then want to move on to a contemplative life, reflecting back on the shape of your life and what you've experienced. So I think if anyone said no, it's a contemplative life, you leave university and you go straight into being a thinker, a philosopher, I think you'd get everything wrong. Is that okay, or would you like to respond?
That's what Aristotle says then.
That's how I'd interpret it, yeah. Or did you disagree?
Sorry.
Right.
Do you have any kind of point of return?
Yeah.
No, sorry.
Okay.
Jack.
I guess I have more of a historical question.
Mm.
I think it's two questions in one, really.
Mm.
In Anscombe, what do you think the relation is between, say, Anscombe's virtuous endeavour in relation to her stance on sexual ethics, abortion,
Mhm.
and also her supposed charge of anti-Semitism? So that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question, I guess, a broader intellectual context of, okay, in the 50 issue of this article, now, what do you think, or how do you think we should understand this supposed return against utilitarianism, neo-Kantianism, how we should understand this shift to virtue ethics? Perhaps what is the reasoning, what were the cause, what would be the symptom?
Mhm. Okay, so for the first question, so there's two important things to understand, and that is that even though she kind of began this, she didn't really have any much more part in it. She approached morality through specific moral questions, and those that she did, such as war and etc., were heavily influenced by her Catholic faith. So she was devoutly Catholic, and for that reason she obviously came to these views of on a stance that she vehemently opposed abortion. She'd protest against abortion clinics and things like that, and the kind of other side of this is that she thought we couldn't do ethics until we had a proper philosophy of mind. So that's why she then went on to write Intention, and really asking these questions of what is action and things like that. And I think maybe in a part what I've criticised both MacIntyre and Anscombe, I think our understanding of virtue ethic has kind of really been distorted through the lens of the scholastics, because they both see them through Aquinas and thereby through Catholicism, the Catholic Church. That's quite really controversial, but I think you can do better than protesting abortion clinics. And I think the intellectual, so the second question, I think the context I'd put it in is that the failures of Enlightenment philosophy to answer the own questions they set forth, and the most important ones. You can see that in terms of moral obligations and morality. You know, for hundreds of years, they've been grappling with these questions, and each time it moves forward a bit, and it gets a bit more, richer account. But there's still a level of contention, and you can really see that with. So really, the failures of Enlightenment philosophy and a system of morality, I think, sets the scene for a return to virtue ethics. And if you want, you could read an essay, H.A. Pritchard, which was published in 1912, called Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? And it kind of deals with this. Well, we've been dealing with this for hundreds of years, and we're still stuck with, well, I believe this, we believe this, going back and forth, and maybe actually our basis and how we're approaching these things are completely wrong, and we need to make a move away from conceiving it in terms of morality, in terms of obligation, in terms of duty.
Anyone?
No.
Yeah.
Do you think that, because it seems that a lot of the Aristotle stuff is based on a very sort of homogenous society where it's assumed that everyone wants more or less the same thing. And you mentioned with the slaves, well, it's a very different world. Do you think that part of the struggles of the revival stuff is because the world is just such a different place now that can't really be that relevant to the modern world?
Yeah, and I think anyone who tries to attempt to just copy and paste Aristotle's thoughts into philosophy now, modern philosophy now, will be wrong. But I think what we can take from Aristotle, and that's really what we have to do, we have to use Aristotle, is these bases and these understandings, and return to our current systems of, how society is built along now, our conceptions of morality, conceptions of politics, and using that to break a new path. So it's not a return, this isn't a nostalgic call for city-states. This is a return to city-states, and then we can then properly look forward to the future. And actually, that's kind of what MacIntyre's last work does. Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, which I'm reading now. Probably should have read it before, but really just so much to read. And what he really says is that, so just from the blurge, is that, so to understand our modern condition, which he calls liberal modernity, we can understand it through a neo-Aristotelian or Thomistic perspective, and arguing that through this perspective, informed by Marx's insights, provides with a resource for constructing a contemporary politics and ethics which both enable us and require us to act against modernity from within modernity. So I'd say moving away from marketization, moving away from capitalism, and having much richer political communities and a much richer morality, much richer ethics. So no, I think definitely this isn't, you're not just trying to take what Aristotle said and applying it now, because that's useless. MacIntyre recognizes that, and especially because the virtues, each set of virtues are wedded to each specific social context they come from. So we'd have to look at our own social context, our own political community that exists now, and then move forward in terms of what virtues are. And just one last thing to say is that many virtue ethicists are no longer saying we need a list of virtues, say courage, magnanimity, greatness of soul, but rather say really what we can do is we can look at our lives, and in our lives we can look at around 8. MacIntyre has 8, Nussbaum has 8 to 10 spheres within our lives, such as education, friendship, love, things like that, where we can ask, what is it to live well in these spheres of life? What is it to have a good education? What is it to have good friendship? And that should really serve the basis. So less of, specific lists taken from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, so I know I have tons of questions now, but back to knowledge, you mentioned Nussbaum, way to come in. So Nussbaum has like a massive criticism of Aristotle's ethical theory, saying that he has quite a few controversial assumptions about the nature of human ethics, man is political and all that. Obviously Nussbaum is against the social contract theory and thinks it's quite exclusionary. And then also Anscombe, I don't know what the first name is, but Spellman, she talks about the circular, and Mackie also talks about the circular logic Aristotle uses to enforce that men are greater than women in the political sphere, ethics sphere. And the whole point of this is that Nussbaum says Aristotle's assumptions are based on the fact that like a person's political, ethical views are good, right? I think most people agree with that. He believes in the good, that people are good, but politics is not the same. If you have political theory in which you can derive politics from your own ethical assumptions, the whole thing's a breakdown. Politics isn't supposed to be an assumptionary take of things, where ethics is. Everyone has their own ethical assumptions. And so couldn't you argue that the reason there's this massive turn, and it's justified not because that people are misinterpreting Aristotle's political view, but more there should be a turn because of the way our culture's come, and that politics is supposed to be a fair issue, whereas ethics isn't fair. You see the question I'm trying to make?
No, could you
so
about why ethics isn't fair politics?
Right, so the turn, I'm saying the turn, could you not say the turn away from Aristotle isn't because his critics misunderstood him, but rather because they actively wanted to change the fact that politics and ethics isn't at all. Like they're not ignoring that it wasn't, they just want to move away from it.
Yeah, I think definitely in terms of enlightened philosophy, you see a turn away from an Aristotelian conception of ethics and politics into, say, deontology and things like that, where there is a cleavage from ethics and politics, and they want that. They want to have that cleavage, even though, say, Kant then has his kingdom of ends and things like that. They do exist as a separate sphere, and they kind of serve their purpose because if they're taken together, Aristotle does, the system can't work. So I think it is quite a conscious choice, and I think MacIntyre does it quite well, has this turn away from politics and ethics, as to get one together is wedded with the introduction, with the Enlightenment philosophy, capitalism, and the creation of the modern individual as understood. And that's an atomized individual, so it's divorced from the social context and divorced from the political community. So all this kind of necessitates a move away from understanding politics and ethics together. I think it's, yeah. And I think it's correct. It's not really an assumption, I think. It's quite clear, so in terms of a liberal conception, which I've been arguing against that, where does the pre-political right to property come from? Locke assumes it, Nozick assumes it. Why is the household apolitical or pre-political? Why is there a right to free speech, such as in America? Why is that apolitical? I think trying to carving out these areas where politics doesn't intrude on is misguided, and when it comes down to it, kind of indefensible, in that there really aren't. It just comes down to assumption that really we must do so. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Sorry. Any more questions? I've got one final one.
Okay.
Sorry to keep people.
Okay,
But
yeah.
so I think kind of part of what you pick out on the strength of Aristotle's account here is we kind of have this two-way relationship between politics and ethics, right?
Yeah,
Is that both it kind of people are part of the state and kind of are constituted in some sense through the state, and so is there kind of almost in any case going to be, it sort of comes back again to kind of like the change in society type thing, but I think very few people, when you kind of particularly, when you have like identities which are constituted through multiple different social groups, so that's part of what's kind of going on in Aristotle's original argument, is you can kind of talk about actually as a group of 300 people. When you're part of that group and as a kind of soul group which you're part of, you can kind of be constituted through that. But when individuals themselves can be constituted through multiple nationalities, multiple ethnicities, and then cultures, do you want to say that actually in all of these cases, these separate groups have the same kind of political nature, or is that kind of an inherent fragmentation which kind of means that these groups can't get towards the idea of the political that Aristotle's talking about?
I think definitively there is a conflict in terms of homogeneous and the disparity in contemporary culture. Even myself, I was born in America to Chilean parents, and now I live here in the UK. So which political community do I belong to? So it is a difficulty, and that's why MacIntyre, really, if you accept any of these arguments, you have to go against the current conception of the nation state and politics as it is. So I don't think you could say, okay, we're going to work this out. So you can go either two ways, and it's quite more, then this is why people call MacIntyre communitarian, but then it's an awful term, doesn't really mean anything. But there's an advocation for a scaling down of the community and wetting things down. But then also I think I wouldn't want to do so. And though I also object to, say, the nation state as it is now, I don't think there should be terms of a regression. Where that meaning and where that political community comes from in such a disparate world is a difficult one. But I think in terms of politics, it can be constituted in terms of, say like MacIntyre's Marxism. It's an internationalism. it's across the world. I don't know. It's certainly a difficult question, and I think it's one of the primary ones which your ethicists have to respond to.
I mean, that's just a kind of add-on
Yeah.
point, which you might want to take that. I guess my kind of question could always be construed as immediately kind of assuming these people are kind of identified to politics as the administration of things, right?
Yeah.
And so that question, you could argue, kind of almost doesn't get off the ground because you're viewing politics not in an Aristotelian sense.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you very much, guys. Round of applause.
Thank you.